In the autumn of 462 BC, a 7-year-old Spartan boy named Damaratos stood in the courtyard of his family home while his mother cut his hair short in the military style. He did not understand why she was crying. He knew only that today was the day he would leave home forever, that he would become part of the Agoge, the state training system that would transform him from a child into a Spartan warrior. His father had told him this was a great honor, that every Spartan boy went through this, that he should be proud. What Damaratos did not know was that his mother was not crying from pride. She was crying because she understood what her son was about to experience, the systematic brutality that awaited him, the things that would be done to him in the name of creating the perfect soldier. She knew that the boy leaving her home today would never truly return, that even if his body survived the training, his spirit would be so thoroughly broken and rebuilt that the child she had raised would cease to exist. She kissed Damaratos one final time and whispered in his ear, "Remember that you are loved. Remember that before all of this, you were my son." Then the state officials arrived, and Damaratos was taken away to begin a process that would last until he was 30 years old, a process of indoctrination, exploitation, and systematic abuse disguised as the most honored training system in the ancient world. This is the story of Sparta's hidden initiation rites. These are the secrets that Spartans kept from other Greek states, the practices they threatened to kill anyone who revealed, the systematic exploitation of children and young people that created the most feared military force in Greece. And I need you to understand that what I am about to describe is not mythology or sensationalized fiction. This is documented in ancient sources, written about by Greek historians like Plutarch and Xenophon, criticized by philosophers like Aristotle, and whispered about in scandalized gossip throughout the ancient Mediterranean world. If you want to understand how entire societies can normalize the systematic abuse of children, how military cultures create loyalty through trauma, how what we call honor can disguise horrific exploitation, then subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that subscribe button and tell me in the comments where you are watching from and whether you knew about the darker side of Sparta before watching this video. Now let me tell you about the Agoge, the Spartan training system, and why it was designed not just to create soldiers, but to destroy individuality and enforce absolute obedience through methods that would be recognized as abuse in any other context. But I'm warning you now, what comes next is far darker than anything you've ever heard about ancient Sparta. The Agoge was the state-controlled education and training system that every Spartan male citizen had to complete. It began at age 7, when boys were taken from their families and organized into groups called agili, herds, like cattle being sorted for breeding. The word choice was not accidental. Spartans did not see these boys as individual children to be nurtured. They saw them as raw material to be forged into weapons, as animals to be trained into tools of state power. The boys were assigned to communal barracks, where they would live under the supervision of older youths and adult overseers, called paidonomoi, literally boy herders. The paidonomoi had absolute authority over the boys. They could punish at will, beat at discretion, humiliate without consequence. The only rule was that the punishment should serve the goal of creating hardened warriors. Any method that broke the boys' individual will and rebuilt them as obedient soldiers was not just permitted but encouraged. From the moment Damaratos entered the barracks, he learned that his previous life was over. The other boys in his group, all 7 years old like him, were strangers who would become closer than family, bound together not by love, but by shared trauma and survival. They were given new names, group names that erased their family connections. Damaratos's group was called the Fox Cohort. From now on, he was not Damaratos, son of Alcibiades. He was simply Fox 7, one unit in a collective that had no individual identity. But here's where it starts to get dark, and I need you to understand the deliberate cruelty built into this system from day one. The boys were intentionally underfed. The food provided in the barracks was insufficient. just barely enough to prevent starvation, but not enough to satisfy the hunger of growing children. This was not an accident or a resource shortage. This was deliberate policy, documented in the writings of Plutarch, who described the Spartan system in detail based on earlier sources. The boys were encouraged to steal food from the surrounding areas, from Spartan households, from the helots who worked the land, from anywhere they could. But here's the twist that reveals the psychological manipulation at work, the genius of Spartan cruelty. They were not punished for stealing. They were punished for getting caught. If a boy successfully stole food and returned with it undetected, he was praised for his cunning and resourcefulness. If he was caught, he was beaten savagely, not for the theft itself, but for his failure to be stealthy enough. Think about what this does to a child's moral development. It teaches that rules exist not because they are right, but because authority enforces them. It teaches that getting away with things is more important than doing the right thing. It teaches cunning over ethics, survival over morality. It rewires the child's entire understanding of right and wrong, replacing normal human conscience with pure pragmatism and obedience to power. Let me tell you what happened to Demaratos on his third night in the barracks. He was desperately hungry, having eaten almost nothing for 3 days, except the thin gruel provided at communal meals. The gruel was mostly barley and water, flavored with a tiny amount of pork fat. It filled the stomach momentarily, but provided almost no nutrition. Demaratos could feel his body weakening, could feel the constant gnawing hunger that made it hard to think about anything else. An older boy, maybe 10 years old, approached Demaratos and the other new arrivals. His name was Alcides, and he had been in the barracks for 3 years. He had the hard, lean look of someone who had learned to survive on minimal food. He told the new boys, "You need to steal, or you will not survive. Some boys in every cohort die in the first year because they are too weak or too stupid to steal successfully. Do you want to be one of them?" Alcides pointed out a house not far from the barracks. "That household has bread baking tonight. I can smell it. The kitchen entrance is on the east side. Wait until late, after the family has gone to bed. Take only a little so they do not notice immediately. And do not get caught. If you get caught, you will be beaten so badly you will wish you were dead." Demaratos waited until deep night, until the barracks overseer was asleep, or at least pretending to be. He crept out into the darkness, his heart pounding with fear and guilt and desperate hunger. He made his way to the house Alcides had pointed out. He found the kitchen entrance, a simple door that was not locked, because who would lock their door in Sparta, where the penalty for theft was supposedly so severe? Inside, he could see loaves of bread cooling on a wooden table. The smell made his mouth water and his stomach cramp with hunger. He crept inside, moving as silently as he could. He reached for a small loaf, the smallest one, thinking that it might not be missed. His fingers closed around the bread. But then a voice behind him said, "What do you think you are doing, boy?" Demaratos spun around and saw the homeowner, a middle-aged Spartan man holding an oil lamp. The man's face showed not anger but something like satisfaction, as if he had been waiting for this. Demaratos tried to run, but the man was faster. He grabbed Demaratos by the arm and dragged him back to the barracks. He delivered the boy to the paidonomos on duty, explaining that he had caught this young thief in his kitchen. The paidonomos did not care that Demaratos had been stealing to avoid starvation. He did not care that a 7-year-old child was being forced into theft by deliberate state policy. He cared only that Demaratos had failed the test of stealth, had gotten caught, had proven himself incompetent. The paidonomos woke all the boys in the barracks. He made them form a circle around Demaratos. Then he told Demaratos to lie face down on the floor. Demaratos obeyed, terrified, while the paidonomos selected a rod from a collection kept specifically for beatings. The rod was made of hardwood, about 3 feet long and an inch thick. It would hurt terribly, but probably would not cause permanent injury. The paidonomos announced to the assembled boys, "This one failed. He was caught stealing. Not because stealing is wrong, you are all expected to steal, but because he was clumsy and stupid. Watch what happens to those who fail. Then he began beating Damaratos. 20 strikes across the back and legs. Each one sent explosive pain through Damaratos's small body. He screamed and cried, unable to control his reaction, which only made things worse. The Paidonomos paused and said, "He cries like a girl. He is weak. Spartans do not cry." Then he administered 10 more strikes as additional punishment for crying. By the end, Damaratos was sobbing uncontrollably, his back and legs covered in welts and bruises that would take weeks to heal. The Paidonomos sent him back to his sleeping mat with no food, his body aching, his spirit crushed by the understanding that this was just the beginning, that this was what Spartan training meant. But here's what makes this even more twisted. The next day, Alcidas approached Damaratos and said, "You failed because you went too early and were too loud. Tonight, I will show you how to do it properly. Watch and learn." That night, Alcidas successfully stole food from the same household and shared a portion with Damaratos. The lesson was clear. Failure brought punishment. Success brought reward. The morality of the act itself was irrelevant. But wait, because the hunger was just the beginning of the systematic cruelty built into the Agoge. The boys were also subjected to exposure to the elements in ways designed to harden them physically while breaking them psychologically. They slept on reed mats they had to gather and make themselves from reeds growing by the river, but they were not allowed to use tools. They had to break the reeds with their bare hands, a task that left their hands cut and bleeding. This was considered character building. Let me tell you about another boy in Damaratos's cohort named Leonidas. Not the famous king who would die at Thermopylae, but another Leonidas, one of dozens of boys who bore that common Spartan name. This Leonidas was smaller than the other boys, weaker, less naturally athletic. From the first day, he struggled with every aspect of training. When the boys were told to gather reeds for their sleeping mats, Leonidas could not break enough reeds. His hands bled and became infected. He developed a fever, but was not allowed to rest or seek medical care, because showing weakness was unacceptable. He was forced to continue training, to participate in combat exercises where larger boys beat him easily, to attempt to steal food, though he was too weak and clumsy to succeed. After 3 months, Leonidas died. The infection in his hands had spread up his arms and into his blood. He died of fever in the barracks, lying on an incomplete reed mat, surrounded by boys who had been taught not to show compassion or grief. The Paidonomos announced that Leonidas had been weak, that he had failed to meet Spartan standards, that his death proved he was unworthy of citizenship. His body was removed and buried with minimal ceremony in an unmarked grave. The other boys learned the lesson. Weakness meant death. Failure meant erasure. Survival required becoming hard enough to endure anything without complaint or visible emotion. Damaratos looked at where Leonidas's mat had been and felt a cold understanding settle over him. He would survive. He would do whatever was necessary, because the alternative was to die forgotten like Leonidas. The boys were also forced to go barefoot year-round, even in winter. They wore only a single thin cloak regardless of weather. The winters in the mountains around Sparta could be harsh, with snow and freezing temperatures. But Spartan boys wore their thin cloaks and no shoes and were expected to continue training as if the cold did not exist. If a boy shivered or showed signs of cold, he was mocked by the older boys and might be forced to sleep outside as punishment for weakness. Several boys in each cohort would die during winter from exposure or from infections that went untreated, because seeking medical care was considered unmanly. The Paidonomoi would announce that these boys had failed, that Spartans were supposed to be tougher than weather, that death from cold proved weakness of character, rather than the insanity of forcing children to endure winter without adequate clothing or shelter. But what happens next is even worse. The physical hardship was terrible, but the psychological manipulation was more devastating in the long term. The boys were taught, that they had no value as individuals, that their worth came only from their usefulness to Sparta, that their bodies were not their own, but property of the state to be used as Sparta saw fit. This teaching was reinforced through constant competition and comparison. The boys were ranked against each other in every activity. Who could run fastest? Who could fight best? Who could endure pain longest? Who could steal most successfully? The rankings were public, announced regularly so that everyone knew exactly where they stood in the hierarchy. Boys at the bottom faced additional punishments and humiliations. Boys at the top received better food and privileges. This created an environment where cooperation was impossible, and every other boy was a rival. You could not trust anyone, because everyone was competing for the limited rewards available. You could not form genuine friendships, because your friend today might beat you in combat tomorrow and receive praise while you received punishment for losing. The isolation was profound, even though the boys were never physically alone. Now let me tell you about the aspect of Spartan training that ancient sources hint at, but that was kept deliberately secret. The aspect that reveals how the Agoge used not just physical hardship, but intimate relationships as tools of control. This is where the story gets significantly darker and where you need to understand the power dynamics that made resistance impossible. When a boy reached around age 12, after 5 years in the Agoge, he would be assigned a mentor. The Spartans called this system the Aristes-Eromenos relationship, which translates roughly as lover-beloved or mentor-mentee. An older male, usually in his 20s or early 30s, would choose a younger boy to guide through the next stage of training. Ancient sources like Plutarch and Xenophon describe these relationships in idealized terms. They claim the older man was supposed to be a moral exemplar, teaching the boy courage, discipline, virtue, and proper Spartan values. The relationship was supposedly about education and character formation, about the older man's duty to shape the next generation of warriors. But here's what those sanitized ancient accounts don't fully admit, and this is where it gets really dark. These relationships involved profound power imbalances, and often included intimate components that gave the older man extensive control over the younger boy's body and life. The mentor had authority to punish his mentee, to command obedience, to shape every aspect of the boy's development. And in Spartan culture, where the relationship between mentor and mentee was often explicitly compared to marriage, the implications were clear to everyone, even if they were not stated openly in official accounts. Let me tell you what happened to Damaratos when he turned 12. He had survived 5 years of the Agoge. Many boys in his original cohort had not. Some had died from exposure, from untreated injuries, from illnesses that were ignored as weakness. Leonidas and 6 others from his original group of 20 were dead. Others had been expelled from the training for failing to meet Spartan standards, condemned to become perioikoi, the lower class of non-citizens who lived in Spartan territory but had no political rights or honor. Damaratos had survived by becoming hard, by learning not to cry no matter how much pain he experienced, by stealing successfully and fighting brutally when required. He had killed his compassion, his gentleness, everything soft in himself, because those things meant weakness, and weakness meant death. He was 12 years old and already a damaged person, someone who could watch another boy die without feeling anything. Then a man named Aristomenes came to observe the training exercises. Aristomenes was 28 years old, a full Spartan citizen who had completed his own training years earlier and who was now looking to take a mentee. He watched the boys practicing combat with wooden swords and shields. He watched Damaratos, in particular, observing how the 12-year-old moved, how he fought, whether he showed promise as a future warrior. Damaratos noticed the man watching him but did not know why. After the exercise, Aristomenes approached the Paidonomos and indicated that he wished to mentor Damaratos. The Paidonomos agreed immediately. This was a good match. Aristomenes was from a prominent family, had a good military record, and had sufficient status to mentor a boy who showed promise. There was no consultation with Damaratos. The boy had no say in this arrangement. One day he was simply told that Aristomenes was now his mentor, that he owed Aristomenes obedience and loyalty above all others except Sparta itself, that this relationship would continue until Damaratos completed his training at age 20. Aristomenes took Damaratos aside to a quiet area away from the other boys. He looked at the 12-year-old carefully, assessing him not just as a future warrior, but as something else, something more personal. Then he spoke. "I am your Aristes now. You are my Eromenos. I will teach you to be a true Spartan warrior. You will obey me in all things. You will attend me at the Syssitia when I dine with my mess group. You will learn from watching how real Spartans conduct themselves. And you will understand that my honor depends on your performance. If you fail, if you show weakness, if you bring shame, then you shame me, and I will not tolerate being shamed." He paused, then added something that made Damaratos' stomach tighten with anxiety. "You will also understand that our relationship is sacred. It is blessed by Spartan tradition. What happens between us is for our benefit and for the benefit of Sparta. You will tell no one outside our relationship what I teach you or how I teach you. This is private. This is ours. Do you understand?" Damaratos nodded, because what else could he do? He was 12 years old, property of the state, assigned to this man by authority he could not question. And he had heard the whispers from older boys who already had mentors, whispers about what these relationships actually involved, about what mentors expected from their mentees, about things that could not be spoken of openly but that everyone understood. What Aristomenes did not need to say explicitly, because Damaratos understood from the way older boys talked and from the fear he saw in some of their eyes, was that this relationship involved more than just military training. The mentor had rights over his mentee's body, could demand intimacy as part of the bonding that supposedly created superior warriors. The relationship was framed as sacred, as essential for producing the fierce loyalty that made Spartan soldiers fight to the death for each other. But it was also coercive, backed by the threat of punishment and social destruction for any boy who refused his mentor's demands. Let me be absolutely clear about what I'm describing here, because this is important to understand. These were not equal relationships between consenting adults. These were relationships between grown men and 12-year-old boys. Relationships where the power dynamic made genuine consent impossible. Relationships that in any modern context would be recognized as exploitation and abuse. But in Sparta, they were not just tolerated. They were institutionalized, celebrated, considered essential to the Spartan way of life. Ancient sources dance around this reality with euphemistic language, but the truth emerges between the lines if you know how to read them. Xenophon claims that Spartan mentor relationships were pure and that any physical intimacy was forbidden, but he writes this while also noting that Sparta's laws on this matter were unique in Greece, and that other Greeks did not believe Spartan claims of purity. Why would Xenophon need to so vigorously defend the purity of these relationships if there were not widespread accusations that they involved more than just intellectual mentorship? Plutarch describes the relationships as deeply emotional bonds that transcended normal friendship, using language that clearly indicates romantic and physical dimensions, even as he tries to frame them as virtuous. He writes that the Aristes and Eromenos were inseparable, that they shared everything, that the mentor felt the boy's shame as his own, and the boy felt pride in his mentor's accomplishments. This level of emotional enmeshment goes far beyond normal teaching relationships. And here's what makes the whole system even more insidious. A boy who refused a mentor's advances, who resisted this aspect of the relationship, could find himself socially destroyed. He might be expelled from training. He might be mocked publicly as unmanly or as failing to understand true Spartan brotherhood. His entire future as a citizen was at risk. So boys submitted, not because they wanted to, but because the alternative was losing everything, becoming nothing in the only society they knew. Damaratos learned quickly what was expected of him. Aristomenes was not cruel by Spartan standards. He did not beat Damaratos unnecessarily. He provided additional food, helped Damaratos improve his combat skills, and protected him from some of the worst abuses that boys without mentors endured. But he also demanded obedience in all things, including things that Damaratos found disturbing and confusing, things that he had no framework for understanding except that resistance would mean destruction. The first time Aristomenes brought Damaratos to his home, away from the barracks and away from any oversight, Damaratos felt a terror he had not experienced since his first days in training. Aristomenes told him to undress, that he needed to inspect the boy's body, to assess his physical development, and to check for injuries that might need attention. Damaratos undressed, standing naked while Aristomenes walked around him, touching him, examining him with hands that lingered too long and moved to places that had nothing to do with checking for injuries. Then Aristomenes told Damaratos that part of their relationship would involve physical closeness, that this was how Spartan warriors bonded, that this was sacred and necessary, and that Damaratos should feel honored. What happened next I will not describe in explicit detail because this is not that kind of content, but you understand what happened. What was done to a 12-year-old boy by a grown man who had complete power over him? It was called sacred mentorship. It was called education. It was recorded in Spartan culture as a noble tradition. But Damaratos knew, even at 12, even after 5 years of indoctrination, that what had been done to him was not sacred. It was not education. It was violation disguised as tradition, exploitation disguised as honor. And there was nothing he could do about it, no one he could tell, no justice he could seek. Because the men who had done this to him were the same men who defined what justice meant, who spoke for Sparta, who controlled every aspect of his existence. This pattern would repeat throughout Damaratos' training. Aristomenes would summon him regularly. Sometimes it was truly about combat training or lessons in Spartan history and values. But often it was about exercising the rights that Spartan culture gave mentors over their mentees, rights that treated 12-year-old boys as possessions to be used for the pleasure and purposes of older men. And here's what you need to understand about how this system worked. It was not just one man exploiting one boy. It was systematic, institutionalized, involving hundreds of such relationships at any given time. Every Spartan citizen had gone through this as a boy. Every Spartan citizen knew what these relationships really involved. And yet they continued, generation after generation, because this was how Sparta created its warriors, by breaking boys completely and rebuilding them as men who had been so thoroughly violated and controlled that they would do anything to feel powerful, who would fight with suicidal courage because they literally had nothing left of themselves except their role in the collective. But what happens next is somehow even darker, because the Agoge included rituals that went far beyond training and mentorship into territory that reveals just how thoroughly Spartan society was built on systematic violence and exploitation. Hold on, because this next part is going to shock you even more. When boys reached around age 18, after 11 years in the Agoge, the most promising among them were selected for an elite training program called the Crypteia. The word Crypteia means secret service, or hidden things, and it was one of the most closely guarded aspects of Spartan culture. The Crypteia was supposedly a rite of passage that tested whether a young man was ready to become a full citizen. What it actually was state-sanctioned murder used as an initiation into Spartan citizenship. Let me tell you what Plutarch, writing centuries after the fact, but drawing on earlier sources that have not survived, says about the Crypteia. Every autumn, Spartan officials would secretly declare war on the Helots, the enslaved population that worked Spartan land and vastly outnumbered the Spartan citizens. The Helots were the conquered population of Messenia and Laconia, people who had been enslaved generations earlier and who remained in permanent servitude to Sparta. This declaration of war served a legal and religious purpose. It meant that killing Helots during this period would not pollute the killers with blood guilt, would not require purification rituals, would not anger the gods. It was not murder, but war, and war killing was permissible and even honorable. Then selected young men from the Agoge would be sent into the countryside, armed only with knives and carrying minimal supplies. They would hide during the day in remote areas and emerge at night to hunt helots. The young men were supposed to kill the strongest helots they could find, particularly those who showed signs of leadership or resistance, those who might be capable of organizing a rebellion if left alive. The purpose was dual. It reduced the helot population and eliminated potential rebels before they could act, and it forced the young Spartans to cross the threshold from training violence to actual killing, to prove they could murder in cold blood without hesitation or remorse, to demonstrate that they valued Spartan power above any normal human prohibition against killing. Let me tell you what happened when Damaratos was selected for the Crypteia at age 18. His mentor, Aristomenes, told him that this was the highest honor, that he should be proud, that this would prove he was worthy of becoming a Spartan citizen. Only the best were chosen for the Crypteia. Only those who had shown they could be trusted with the darkest secrets of Spartan power. Damaratos was given a knife, a dark cloak, and instructions. He was to go into the territory where helots worked the fields and lived in their small communities. He was to observe, select a target, and kill. He was to return with proof of the kill, perhaps a piece of clothing or a description that could be verified, and he was not to be caught or identified. The killings had to appear random, unpredictable, part of the constant terror that kept the helot population submissive. Damaratos had been trained in combat for 11 years. He knew how to kill in theory. He had practiced killing strokes on dummies and animals, but he had never actually killed a human being. The thought terrified him, but he could not show fear. Showing fear would mean he was unworthy. It would mean all his years of training had been wasted. It would mean shame for himself and for Aristomenes, who had mentored him. He went into the countryside at dusk and found a place to hide in a grove of trees near a helot village. He watched as the helots finished their day's labor and returned to their homes. These were people who had worked all day in Spartan fields, growing food that Spartans would eat while the helots themselves received only minimal rations. They were exhausted, thin from chronic malnutrition, wearing ragged clothing. They were utterly powerless, living in constant fear of Spartan violence. Damaratos identified his target according to the criteria he had been given. A man in his 30s, who appeared strong despite the harsh conditions, who seemed to have authority over the other helots, organizing them and directing their work. That made him a good target, according to the Crypteia mission. He was strong enough to be dangerous. He had leadership qualities that might make him capable of organizing resistance. He needed to be eliminated. Damaratos waited until deep night when the village was dark and silent. Then he crept to the home where his target slept. The door was not locked. Helots were not allowed locks. That would suggest they had something to protect, some privacy or dignity that Sparta might respect. They had nothing. Their homes could be entered at any time by any Spartan for any reason. Damaratos entered silently, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might give him away. He found the man sleeping on a simple mat. The man's wife slept beside him. Children slept in another corner. The family was crowded into a single small room, living in poverty that contrasted sharply with the relative comfort of even the poorest Spartan citizens. What happened next took only seconds, but felt like hours to Damaratos. He approached the sleeping man. He raised his knife. He struck, covering the man's mouth with one hand, while driving the blade into his throat with the other, exactly as he had been taught. The man jerked awake, his eyes widening in terror and confusion. He struggled briefly, making muffled sounds, his hands reaching up to grab at Damaratos. Then his body went slack. Blood spread across the mat, dark in the moonlight coming through the door. The wife woke up. She saw what was happening. She saw her husband's body going still, saw the blood, saw the shadowy figure of Damaratos standing over them. She screamed. The sound was piercing, horrible, full of grief and terror. Damaratos ran. He fled the house, ran through the dark village while lights began appearing in other homes, ran into the countryside with the sound of the wife's screaming following him. He ran until he could run no more, then collapsed in a field, gasping and shaking. He looked at his hands, covered in the blood of a man he had murdered, a man who had done nothing to him, whose only crime was being strong and therefore threatening to Spartan control. Damaratos vomited. Then he cried, something he had not done since he was 7 years old. He cried for what he had done, for what he had become, for the boy he had been who would never have imagined doing such a thing. But he also knew that when he returned to Sparta and reported his successful kill, he would be praised, he would be honored, he would be one step closer to becoming a full citizen. He sat in that field for hours, unable to move, unable to think, just staring at his bloody hands and trying to understand what he had become. Eventually, he forced himself to stand. He made his way back to Sparta as dawn was breaking. He reported to his overseer that he had completed his mission. He was praised for his success and told to rest and prepare for the completion of his training. But Damaratos never forgot that night. He never forgot the man's face in the moment of waking, the terror in his eyes, the feeling of the knife sliding into flesh. He never forgot the wife's screaming. For the rest of his life, he would hear that sound in his dreams, and he would know that this was what Sparta had made him into. Not a warrior defending his city from enemies, a murderer, an assassin who killed enslaved people in their homes to maintain a system of terror. This was the Cryptia. This was what Sparta required of its young men. Not just the ability to fight in battle against armed enemies, but the willingness to murder defenseless people in their homes, to kill in cold blood without justification, except maintaining state power through terror. And this was framed as sacred duty, as necessary for Sparta's survival, as proof of courage rather than what it actually was. Proof of how thoroughly the Agoge had destroyed normal human empathy and replaced it with absolute obedience to state commands. But wait, because there's another layer to this that some ancient sources hint at but never explicitly describe, and this is where it gets even more disturbing. Some scholars studying Spartan culture have noted that the Crypteia probably involved not just killing, but other forms of domination and humiliation of helots. The helot population lived in constant terror of Spartan violence. Part of that terror came from unpredictable attacks that could happen at any time, but part of it may have come from other forms of violation that reinforced the absolute power Spartans held over helot bodies and lives. Ancient sources are deliberately vague about this, using phrases like treated them with all manner of indignity, or subjected them to shameful treatment beyond mere killing. These euphemisms suggest that young Spartans may have been encouraged to violate helots in multiple ways as part of proving their dominance and willingness to do whatever the state required. The evidence is not conclusive, but the pattern fits with how Sparta used systematic violation as a tool of control in other aspects of its culture. Think about what this means. Young men who had themselves been violated and exploited throughout their training were now being sent to violate and exploit others. The cycle of abuse perpetuated itself. Those who had been made powerless as children were given power over an even more powerless population as young adults. And they were encouraged to exercise that power in the most brutal ways possible to prove they had been successfully transformed from feeling human beings into tools of state violence. Now, let me tell you about another category of initiation rites that were public, witnessed by crowds, and that reveal how Sparta used religious justification to legitimize extreme brutality. These were the flogging rituals performed at the altar of Artemis Orthia, one of Sparta's most important religious sites. When boys reached a certain point in their training, usually around age 14 or 15, they would participate in what was called the diamastagosis, the ordeal of whips. This was a public ritual where boys would be flogged at the altar of the goddess, not as punishment for any specific crime, but as a test of endurance and as an offering of blood to Artemis. Let me describe what this ritual looked like, based on Plutarch's detailed account and on archaeological evidence from the sanctuary of Artemis Orthia. A large crowd would gather at the sanctuary. Priests would prepare the altar, making sure it was clean and ready to receive the blood that would soon flow. The boys participating in the ritual would be brought forward, stripped to minimal clothing or completely naked depending on the specific period. They would be told that they were about to approach the altar where cheese had been placed as an offering. The boys were instructed to try to steal the cheese, supposedly reenacting an ancient myth about theft and punishment, about a time when some boys had stolen from the goddess and been punished for it. But in this reenactment, the punishment was real and the theft was expected. As the boys approached the altar and tried to take the cheese, other young men would begin beating them with whips. These were not light symbolic strikes. These were brutal beatings with whips made of leather or reeds that tore skin and drew blood. The boys were supposed to endure the beating without crying out, without showing pain, without retreating from the altar. They were supposed to grab as much cheese as they could despite the beating, proving their courage and their ability to function through pain. The crowd would watch and judge. The boy who endured the longest, who stole the most cheese despite the beating, who showed the most courage in the face of pain, would be honored as victorious. His name would be recorded. He would receive special recognition. This was considered one of the highest honors a young Spartan could achieve. But here's what makes this absolutely horrifying. The beating did not stop after a few strikes. It continued until the boys could no longer stand, until they collapsed from pain and blood loss, until they were physically incapable of continuing. Plutarch notes that some boys died during this ritual, beaten to death at the altar while the crowd watched. The altar was permanently stained with the blood of children, and this was considered appropriate, even sacred. The religious justification was that Artemis Orthia demanded blood sacrifice, that the goddess was pleased by the suffering of the young, that their willingness to endure proved their devotion. But the real purpose was the same as all the other Agoge rituals. Break the boys. Teach them that pain is meaningless. Teach them that individual suffering does not matter. Teach them that they exist only to serve Sparta, and that Sparta demands absolute sacrifice. Let me tell you what happened when Damaratos participated in this ritual at age 15. He stood with other boys his age, waiting his turn to approach the altar. He could hear the crack of whips and the muffled sounds of pain from boys trying not to scream. He could see blood on the stones around the altar, bright red in the sunlight. He could see boys collapsing, being dragged away by attendants while the crowd cheered or jeered depending on how long the boy had lasted. He was terrified but could not show it. His mentor Aristomenes was in the crowd watching. His performance in this ritual would reflect on Aristomenes as well as on himself. He had to do well. He had to endure longer than the others. He had to prove himself worthy. When his turn came, Damaratos approached the altar. He could see the pieces of cheese that had been placed there. He reached for one, closing his hand around it. Then the whips began striking his back and legs. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, worse than any beating he had received during training. These were not controlled strikes designed to punish without causing severe injury. These were vicious blows intended to cause maximum pain and to draw blood. But Damaratos forced himself to stand still, to keep reaching for the cheese, to ignore the pain burning across his body. 1 strike, 2, 10, 20. He grabbed another piece of cheese. The whips continued. He could feel his skin tearing. He could feel blood running down his back and legs. He could feel his strength failing. 30 strikes, 40, 50. Damaratos felt his vision starting to darken at the edges. His legs were shaking. But he forced himself to reach for one more piece of cheese to prove that he could function through any level of pain, that he was Spartan, that pain meant nothing. 60 strikes. His legs gave out. He collapsed onto the blood-soaked stones beside the altar. The beating stopped. Attendants came forward and dragged him away from the altar while the crowd evaluated his performance. He had lasted longer than most, He had grabbed 3 pieces of cheese. He had shown considerable courage. Aristomenes came to him afterwards, while Damaratos lay on his stomach, his back a mass of torn flesh and blood. Aristomenes told him, "You did well. You brought honor to yourself and to me. You proved you are Spartan. You proved that pain cannot break you." But as Damaratos lay there, barely conscious from pain and blood loss, he felt nothing like pride. He felt only pain and exhaustion, and a growing numbness toward his own suffering. He was becoming exactly what Sparta wanted him to become. A weapon without feelings, a tool without humanity, someone who could endure anything because he had been so thoroughly broken that he no longer believed his own pain mattered. Now, here's where the story takes another dark turn. Everything I've described so far focused on boys and young men. But Sparta also subjected its girls and young women to initiation processes that, while different from the Agoge, involved their own forms of control and exploitation. And understanding what happened to Spartan females reveals that this society's systematic abuse was not limited by gender, but extended to everyone who lived under Spartan authority. Spartan girls underwent training that was unique in the ancient Greek world. While women in Athens and other city-states were kept secluded in their homes and given minimal education, Spartan girls participated in state-organized physical training. They wrestled. They ran. They threw javelins and discuses. They competed in athletic contests, sometimes while nude or nearly nude, in front of male observers. This seems progressive, almost feminist, until you understand the purpose. Sparta trained its women not for their own benefit, not for their personal development or empowerment, but to produce strong children for the state. The logic was eugenic and utilitarian. Healthy mothers bore healthy sons, who could become soldiers. Weak mothers bore weak sons, who were useless to Sparta. Therefore, women needed to be physically fit, and the state would ensure that fitness through mandatory training. Let me tell you about Lampedo, a Spartan girl who went through the female training system. Like boys, she was taken from her family at age 7 and enrolled in state training, though girls were allowed to return home at night, unlike boys who lived in barracks. She was organized into groups with other girls her age and subjected to rigorous physical training under the supervision of older women who had themselves gone through the system. The training was harsh from the beginning. The girls ran for miles every day, building endurance. They wrestled each other, learning combat techniques and learning to endure pain and physical domination. They were taught to compete fiercely with each other, told that only the strongest girls would be deemed worthy of marrying full Spartan citizens, that weak girls might be married off to perioikoi or worse. They were deliberately exposed to male observers during training and exercise. The girls would train nude or in minimal clothing while boys and men watched from nearby. This was justified as preparing them for the realities of Spartan life, teaching them not to be modest or ashamed of their bodies because such feelings were considered weakness. But what really happened was that young girls were being conditioned to accept that their bodies were public, were state property, were subject to observation and judgment by those with power over them. The normalization of exposure, the elimination of privacy, these were forms of control that prepared Spartan women to accept their roles in a society that would use their bodies for reproduction, and that would give them no real autonomy, even as it pretended to honor them as mothers of warriors. When Lampedo reached her early teens, the training became more explicitly focused on preparation for her future role. She was taught about Spartan expectations for wives. She was told that her purpose was to bear children, specifically sons, who would become Spartan warriors. She was told that she should be honored by this role, that Spartan women were the most important women in Greece because they produced the best warriors. But she was also taught what would happen if she failed in this role. If she married and failed to produce children, she would be considered defective. If she produced only daughters, she would be considered unfortunate. If she produced sons who were weak or deformed, those sons might be killed, and she would be suspected of having some flaw that produced weak offspring. The pressure was intense. Lampito understood that her entire value as a person depended on her ability to successfully produce healthy male children for Sparta. She was not valued as an individual with thoughts and feelings and potential beyond reproduction. She was valued as a breeding resource, and if she failed in that function, she would be worthless. When Lampito reached marriageable age, around 18, she underwent another ritual that reveals the violence embedded in Spartan marriage customs, even as those customs were supposedly honoring women. Spartan weddings included a ritualized abduction where the groom would kidnap his bride. On the designated night, the young man would come to the girl's home and carry her away, supposedly against her will, though the whole thing was staged and expected. But here's where it gets deeply disturbing. When Lampito was carried away by her designated husband, a man named Lysander, whom she had met only briefly before and who was 10 years older than her, she was taken to a house where other women prepared her for the wedding night. They shaved her head completely bald, exactly like the boys entering the Agoge had their heads shaved. They dressed her in men's clothing, a tunic and cloak like a young man would wear. They positioned her on a bed in a darkened room. Then Lysander came to the room to consummate the marriage. He found not a woman in a wedding dress, but someone whose appearance had been deliberately masculinized, her head shaved, wearing men's clothing, positioned in darkness so her female characteristics were obscured. Ancient sources claim this was done because Spartan men were so accustomed to intimate relationships with other men from the Agoge that this transition helped them adjust to intimacy with women. But think about what this actually reveals. It means Spartan society was so thoroughly organized around male dominance hierarchies and same-gender intimacy during the formative years that women had to be disguised as young men to fit into the system. It means that Spartan men had been so conditioned to view intimacy in terms of dominance and submission, in terms of mentor relationships with younger males, that they could not relate to women as women. Women had to be temporarily made to resemble the eromenos, the submissive younger partner, in order for Spartan men to consummate marriages. The ritual was traumatic for Lampito. She had been given no preparation for what marriage would mean, no explanation of what would happen to her body, no choice in any of it. She was 18 years old, but as naive about adult intimacy as any child, because Spartan girls were not taught about these matters. She had been taught to fight and run and endure pain, but she had not been taught what to expect from a husband. She submitted because she had been trained since age 7 to submit to Spartan authority, because resistance to Spartan customs meant social death, because she had watched what happened to girls who tried to refuse marriages or who failed to fulfill their roles as wives and mothers. Those girls were ostracized, mocked, sometimes expelled from Spartan citizen society to live in disgrace. But wait, it gets worse. After the wedding night, Lysander did not take Lampito to live with him. Spartan men lived in barracks with their military units until age 30. This meant that for the first 12 years of their marriage, Lysander and Lampito would not cohabit. Lysander would visit Lampito periodically, secretly, sneaking away from the barracks to spend time with his wife. These visits were brief and furtive, more like assignations than the normal life of a married couple. The marriage existed primarily to produce children, not to create a partnership or a loving relationship. Lampito's purpose was to bear sons for Sparta, to raise them until age 7 when they would be taken to the Agoge, and to accept that her entire existence was structured around producing the next generation of warriors. She had no independent life, no purpose beyond reproduction, no value except as a vessel for creating future soldiers. When Lampito bore her first son, she experienced what every Spartan mother experienced, the terror of the inspection. Within days of birth, her son was taken by officials who examined him to determine if he met Spartan standards. She was told that if the child appeared weak or deformed, he would be taken to a chasm called the apothete and thrown to his death. This was standard Spartan policy. Weak children could not become strong soldiers, so they were eliminated at birth. Lampido held her newborn son and prayed to any gods who might listen that he would be deemed acceptable. She examined him frantically, looking for any sign that might condemn him, any weakness that might lead to his death. He was small, but all newborns were small. His limbs seemed straight. He cried lustily, which suggested strength. The officials returned him to her after examination. He was acceptable. He would be allowed to live. Lampido wept with relief and terror, relief that her son would live. Terror because she knew that she would raise him only until he turned 7, that he would then be taken into the Agoge, where he would experience everything she had heard whispered about, all the brutality and exploitation that created Spartan warriors. She named him Demaratos, hoping the name would bring him strength. She held him and whispered promises she knew she could not keep. "I will protect you. I will keep you safe. I will not let them hurt you." But she knew these were lies. When he turned 7, she would have no power to protect him. He would be taken, and she would have to stand by and let it happen, because that was what Spartan mothers did. She bore 3 more children over the following years, 2 more sons and a daughter. Each time, she went through the terror of the inspection, knowing that any child deemed weak would be killed. Each time, her children were accepted as viable, but each time, she knew that she was bringing children into a system that would consume them, that would break them and rebuild them into tools of state power. Her daughter went through the female training system, just as Lampido had. Her sons were taken at age 7 into the Agoge. Lampido watched Demaratos leave her home on his 7th birthday, watched him being led away by state officials while she stood silent because showing grief was considered weakness. She never saw him again as the child she had raised. When she encountered him in later years, he was a stranger, a hardened young man who barely acknowledged her, who had been taught that family connections were weakness, that only Sparta mattered. This was Lampido's life. This was what Sparta offered to women, not freedom or empowerment, but a different form of exploitation, using their bodies for reproduction instead of combat, but exploiting them just as thoroughly. Spartan women were supposed to be proud of their role, supposed to be honored as mothers of warriors. But the reality was that they were breeding stock, valued only for their ability to produce soldiers, with no autonomy and no purpose beyond that biological function. Now let me tell you about the secret ceremonies that were perhaps the darkest aspect of Spartan initiation, the rituals that Spartans refused to discuss with outsiders and that they threatened death to anyone who revealed. These ceremonies were designed to complete the psychological transformation from individual person to collective warrior, and they involved methods that sound almost unbelievable, but that were hinted at in enough ancient sources that scholars recognize they must have existed in some form. When young men reached a certain point in their training, possibly around age 16 or 17, they would participate in nighttime ceremonies in remote locations away from the main city. These ceremonies were said to involve oaths of absolute loyalty to Sparta, symbolic deaths and rebirths representing the elimination of the old self, and various ordeals designed to break down any remaining resistance to state control. Ancient sources are frustratingly vague about what exactly happened during these ceremonies, because revealing the details was literally punishable by death or exile. Spartans took their secrets seriously. They believed that the mystery and secrecy itself was part of what made the rituals powerful, that knowing what to expect would diminish their psychological impact. But we can piece together some elements from fragments in various authors, from archaeological evidence at ritual sites outside Sparta, and from comparisons to similar practices in other ancient warrior cultures that had contact with Sparta. What emerges is a picture of ceremonies designed to be psychologically devastating, to break down identity, to create altered states of consciousness, and to bind participants together through shared transgressive experiences. The ceremonies apparently began with purification rituals that were far more elaborate than the normal daily washings. Participants would fast for days beforehand, weakening themselves physically and making them more susceptible to psychological manipulation. They would undergo extended periods of sensory deprivation, sitting in darkness without food or social contact, until their sense of reality began to blur. Then they would be brought to the ceremony site at night, perhaps in a remote grove of trees sacred to one of the gods, perhaps in a cave system, perhaps in a secret sanctuary maintained specifically for these rituals. They would find older men waiting, perhaps wearing masks or costumes that disguised their identities, perhaps representing gods or spirits or ancestors. The ceremonies involved masks for the participants as well. Young men would be given masks to wear, masks representing animals or demons or other identities, transforming them into something other than human. Ancient sources mention wolf masks specifically, as the wolf was sacred to Sparta and symbolized the predator, the pack hunter, the animal that survived through collective violence. Wearing the masks, the young men were told they were no longer themselves. They were no longer individuals with personal identities. They were part of something larger, something that transcended individual existence. They were the pack, the brotherhood, the collective that would fight and kill and die together. The ceremonies also involved nudity and staged vulnerability. The initiates would be stripped naked, exposing themselves completely to the gaze and judgment of those overseeing the ceremony. They would be required to perform humiliating acts in front of their peers and superiors, acts designed to eliminate any remaining pride or sense of individual dignity. Some accounts hint at physical ordeals beyond the normal brutality of training. Perhaps initiates had to prove their courage by handling snakes, or walking through fire, or cutting themselves as blood offerings. Perhaps they had to remain silent and motionless for hours despite intense discomfort. Perhaps they had to endure being struck or handled in ways that tested their ability to accept any treatment without resistance. And there are hints, frustratingly vague but persistent across multiple sources, of intimacy between participants as part of bonding rituals, references to brotherhood of the most complete kind, to sharing all things as the gods share, to acts that created ties of loyalty so strong that participants would rather die than betray each other. These hints suggest that the ceremonies may have involved transgressive acts that bound the participants together through shared secrets, through crossing boundaries that could never be uncrossed, through experiences that were so intense and so forbidden that speaking of them afterwards was literally unthinkable. Let me tell you what might have happened when Damaratos participated in one of these secret ceremonies at age 17. This is speculative, built from fragments and implications rather than explicit descriptions, but it represents the best understanding scholars have developed of what these rituals entailed. Damaratos was told to report to a location outside the city at midnight. He was told to come alone, to tell no one where he was going, to prepare himself through fasting and purification. He spent 3 days eating almost nothing, drinking only water, sitting alone in a dark room at the barracks, not sleeping or speaking, just waiting. When the appointed night came, he left the barracks and made his way to the designated location. It was a grove of trees at the base of Mount Taygetus, far from any settlement. When he arrived, he found other young men from his cohort, perhaps 20 in total, and several older Spartans, whose faces were hidden behind masks shaped like animal skulls. The masked men told the young men to remove all clothing. They stood naked in the cold night air while the overseers walked around them, inspecting them, judging them. Damaratos felt vulnerable and exposed in a way that went beyond mere physical nudity. He felt as if these men could see through his skin to something deeper, could judge whether he was truly worthy of becoming a full Spartan. Then each young man was given a mask to wear. Damaratos received a wolf mask made of leather and fur, with eye holes that restricted his vision and a muzzle that made breathing difficult. Putting on the mask felt like becoming someone else, like the boy named Damaratos was being replaced by something else, something that belonged more completely to Sparta. The masked overseers told them they were no longer boys. They were no longer individuals. They were wolves now, part of the pack, with no identity outside the collective. They were told to move on all fours like animals, to abandon human behavior and human dignity. They were told that during this night they would cross thresholds they could never return from, that they would do things and see things that could never be spoken of. That violation of this secrecy would mean death not just for themselves but for their families. What followed, Damaratos would never be able to fully describe, even in his own mind. The night became a blur of intensity and strangeness. The masked overseers led them through a series of ordeals. They had to crawl on their bellies through mud while being struck with rods. They had to remain completely still for what felt like hours while insects crawled over their bodies. They had to watch acts of violence performed by the overseers, demonstrations of what happened to those who betrayed Sparta's secrets. Then came the part that Damaratos could never fully process or articulate. The young men were paired off and told to perform acts with each other, acts designed to create bonds that transcended normal friendship, bonds forged through shared transgression and mutual vulnerability. The masked overseers watched and commanded and judged, ensuring that every young man participated fully, that no one held back or protected some remaining core of individual dignity. When dawn finally came and the ceremony ended, Damaratos removed the mask and found himself fundamentally changed. He was not the same person who had arrived at that grove. Something essential had been taken from him and replaced with absolute loyalty to Sparta and to the men who had shared that night with him. He was bound now in ways that transcended choice, bound by secrets and shared experiences that were too intense and too transgressive to ever speak of. This was the purpose of the secret ceremonies, not just to create soldiers who would follow orders, but to create men who had been so completely psychologically destroyed and rebuilt that they could not imagine existence outside of Spartan military culture. Men who were bound to each other and to Sparta by secrets that could never be spoken, by shared experiences that were too shameful or too sacred or too disturbing to acknowledge in normal life. And these bonds, forged through systematic exploitation and psychological manipulation, were exactly what made Spartan armies so effective. Spartans fought with suicidal courage because they literally could not imagine life outside the system. They had been taken as children, stripped of family and individual identity, subjected to years of brutality and exploitation, bound to each other through intimacy and shared trauma, taught that their only value was in service to the state, and finally put through secret ceremonies that completed their transformation into weapons rather than people. Now, let me tell you about the Syssitia, the communal dining groups that Spartan men joined at age 20 and that reinforced all the patterns established during the Agoge. Because even after the formal training ended, Sparta continued to control every aspect of its citizens' lives, ensuring that no one ever developed the independence or individual identity that might lead them to question the system. When a young man completed the Agoge at age 20, he was eligible to be elected to citizenship if he could join a Syssition, a dining club of about 15 men who ate together every evening. But joining was not automatic. The existing members had to vote to accept the new candidate, and a single negative vote was enough to reject him. This meant that men who had completed 20 years of training could still be denied citizenship if they had somehow made enemies or failed to conform sufficiently to Spartan ideals. The Syssitia reinforced the collective identity and the suppression of individual preferences that defined Spartan culture. Every citizen had to attend his Syssitian dinner every night, eating the same food as the others, contributing equally to the cost of the meals. The food was deliberately austere. The famous Spartan black broth, made from pork, blood, and vinegar, was said to be so unpalatable that visitors from other Greek cities could barely choke it down. But Spartans ate it every night, because that was what Spartans did, and individual preferences about food were considered weakness. The Syssitia also served as mechanisms of continued surveillance. Men ate together, but they also watched each other constantly, ensuring conformity to Spartan values. Anyone who showed signs of individualism, of questioning Spartan customs, of weakness or inappropriate behavior, would be reported and shamed. The social pressure was immense. Your standing in your secession determined your status in Spartan society. Being excluded or disgraced meant social death, and the secessia reinforced the intimate bonds created during the Agoge. Men who had gone through training together often joined the same secession. The relationships established between mentors and mentees continued in these dining groups. The bonds that had been created through shared exploitation and trauma were maintained throughout life, ensuring that Spartan men remained enmeshed in networks of loyalty that prevented any form of independence. Let me tell you what happened to Damaratos after he completed his training and joined a secession at age 20. He was accepted into a dining group that included his former mentor Aristomenes. Every evening for the rest of his life, or at least until he turned 60 and was no longer required to maintain a secession membership, Damaratos would eat with these men. They would recline on simple couches and eat their meager portions of black broth and barley bread. They would drink wine mixed heavily with water because drunkenness was considered loss of control. They would talk, but the conversations were constrained by unspoken rules. They could discuss military matters, past battles, training techniques. They could tell jokes, though humor that mocked Sparta or Spartan values was forbidden. But they could not discuss personal feelings, could not question Spartan customs, could not express any thought that suggested individual identity separate from collective Spartan identity. Damaratos attended these dinners faithfully, even though he found them oppressive. He ate food he disliked because everyone ate the same food. He participated in conversations that bored him because silence suggested something to hide. He maintained relationships with men he did not particularly like, because those relationships were essential for his status as a citizen. And he understood that this was his life forever. He had completed the Agoge. He had survived the Crypteia. He had participated in the secret ceremonies. He was a Spartan citizen, but he was not free. He would never be free. Every aspect of his existence was still controlled by the collective, still monitored by his peers, still constrained by the expectation that he would suppress any individual identity in favor of being a perfect Spartan warrior. When Damaratos turned 30, he was finally allowed to live with his wife Lampito full-time rather than just visiting her secretly. But even married life was constrained by Spartan values. Damaratos and Lampito were not expected to love each other, to form an emotional partnership, to create a private domestic life separate from public obligations. They were expected to produce children for Sparta. That was the purpose of marriage. They had 4 children together, 3 sons and a daughter. Each son was taken at age 7 into the Agoge, exactly as Damaratos had been taken, exactly as his father had been taken before him. The cycle continued. Generation after generation of children being broken and rebuilt into weapons. Damaratos sometimes wondered if this was all there was, if life was only this endless repetition of trauma and conformity, of suppressing everything individual in service of Sparta's collective identity. But he never spoke these thoughts aloud, because even thinking them was dangerous. Even in the privacy of his own mind, he struggled against thoughts that might make him less than perfectly Spartan. He lived to age 47, which was considered old for a Spartan, given the hazards of constant warfare and the physical damage accumulated during training and battle. He fought in dozens of campaigns. He killed more helots during Crypteia operations when he was young. He killed enemy soldiers from other Greek cities during wars. He performed every duty required of a Spartan citizen with the courage and obedience that had been beaten into him over 40 years. He died in battle during the Theban invasion of Laconia, killed in a conflict he did not understand, fighting for a city-state whose values he had never been allowed to question. His last thoughts, according to later accounts, were not of glory or honor, but of the 7-year-old boy he had been, taken from his mother's arms, the boy who had cried when his head was first shaved, and who had been beaten for that weakness. That boy had been murdered by the Agoge just as surely as Damaratos had murdered that helot during his Crypteia. The difference was that the boy's murder had taken years and had been called education rather than violence. But it was murder nonetheless. The murder of individuality, of choice, of the possibility of being anything other than what Sparta demanded. And here's what you need to understand about the broader implications of all this. The Spartan system was not some unique aberration in history. It was an extreme version of patterns that appear throughout human history whenever societies prioritize military power and collective identity above individual humanity. The systematic exploitation of children, the use of trauma as a bonding mechanism, the destruction of individual identity in favor of collective purpose, the normalization of abuse through appeals to tradition or necessity. These patterns recur again and again. Modern military training still uses some of these techniques, though usually in less extreme forms. Breaking down recruits through verbal abuse and physical hardship, creating unit cohesion through shared suffering. Suppressing individual identity in favor of collective military identity. The techniques persist because they work. They create effective soldiers, but at what cost? And Sparta's system eventually destroyed Sparta itself. By the 4th century before the Common Era, Spartan citizen population was declining catastrophically. The brutal training system killed too many children. The constant warfare killed too many adults. The narrow focus on military culture meant Spartans developed no other skills, no economic base beyond exploiting helots, no ability to adapt to changing circumstances. When Sparta was finally defeated by Thebes at the Battle of Leuctra in 371 before the Common Era, it was not just a military defeat, but a total collapse of the system that had defined Spartan existence for centuries. Without military dominance, Sparta had nothing. The city had built no great monuments. It had produced no art or literature worth preserving. It had created no philosophical or scientific achievements. It had only its warriors, and when those warriors proved not invincible after all, the hollowness at the core of Spartan culture became impossible to ignore. Within a few generations, Sparta had declined from being the dominant military power in Greece to being an insignificant backwater, a tourist attraction where wealthy Romans came to watch reenactments of ancient Spartan customs. The Agoge continued in a form, but it had become performance rather than reality, a show put on for foreigners rather than a genuine system of education. What do you think about this history? How should we view Sparta, which is often romanticized in popular culture as a society of noble warriors living by a code of honor? Can systematic exploitation of children ever be justified by claims of military necessity or cultural tradition? What patterns from Spartan training do you see reflected in modern military or religious or educational institutions? Leave your comments below and share your thoughts about where the line should be drawn between necessary discipline and systematic abuse. If you believe this kind of history needs to be told, that we need to look honestly at the darkness within cultures that are often glorified, then subscribe to this channel. We investigate ancient history without romantic illusions, acknowledging both achievements and atrocities, understanding that human societies are complex and often terrible in their treatment of vulnerable people. Hit that subscribe button and share this video with anyone who needs to understand that not everything called honor is honorable, that not everything called sacred is holy, and that systems built on exploitation eventually consume themselves. The ruins of Sparta still exist in the Peloponnese region of Greece. Tourists visit the site, though there is far less to see than at Athens or Delphi or other Greek cities, because Spartans built few monuments. They preferred to say that their monuments were their warriors, that Spartan courage was more lasting than stone or bronze. But those warriors were children who were systematically broken, people who were denied the possibility of normal human development, victims of a culture that valued military power above everything, including the humanity of its own citizens. Remember Damaratos, 7 years old, crying as his mother cut his hair before sending him to the Agoge. Remember Lampido, her head shaved and dressed as a man for her wedding night. Remember all the children of Sparta who were consumed by a system that claimed to honor them while destroying them. They were people. They suffered. They existed. And they deserve to be remembered not as glorious Spartan warriors, but as victims of systematic abuse disguised as education, as children who were taken and broken and used until they had nothing left to give. See you in the next video.